Right. Order, order. Martyn Day to move the motion.
In Sri Lanka. This story has a long and tragic history. I'm grateful to my colleagues from across the House, those who are here today and those who work with the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Tamils. I'm also grateful to the British Tamil Forum, which plays a key role in supporting the APPG and has been working hard over the past 14 years to raise awareness. They have certainly helped in awakening my consciousness to the plight of the Tamils. Since independence in 1948, there has been an appalling catalogue of massacres of the Tamil people, starting in 1956 with the Ingi Galala massacre and continuing right up until recent times. Generations of oppression have been suffered by the Tamil people, events which still haunt the survivors, a cycle of violence and genocide which is sadly ongoing. 40 years ago, in July 1983, a mass anti-Tamil pogrom broke out in Sri Lanka, during which an estimated 3,000 Tamil people died and 150,000 were made homeless. During the pogrom, Tamil homes, businesses were targeted, with buildings looted and burned and widespread violence. As well as the cost to lives, what has come to be known as Black July led to the loss of around 8,000 Tamil homes and more than 100 industrial plants, more than 5,000 Tamil shops and estimated over 300 million in wealth. The events of July 1983 proved to be one of the catalysts for the decades of civil conflict which followed. However, the pogrom itself was the culmination of decades of anti-Tamil policies and anti-Tamil violence in Sri Lanka, seeds which, if we consider the history, were sown back in the island's colonial era. From the Ceylon Citizenship Act in the 1940s, which left many Tamils stateless, to the deportation of many thousands of Tamils to India between the 1960s and 1980s, to the 1956 Sinhala Only Act, which recognised Sinhalese as the sole official language, replacing English and excluding Tamil. It is clear that for Sri Lanka's Tamils, the history is one of disenfranchisement, deportation, and policies which discriminate against that community's language and culture. Black July, therefore, was not an isolated event, but was part of a wider picture of persecution and cycle of violence. However, it is an event which continues to scar Sri Lankan society to this day. Many Tamils in the UK would now have arrived here after fleeing the 1983 conflict and will remember the events and violence keenly. In Sri Lanka, the pogrom had a devastating effect on the Tamil community, leading not only to the loss of thousands of innocent lives, but to the massive displacement of Tamil families who were forced to flee their homes, as well as causing injury and psychological trauma. Then, in 2009, the Sri Lankan government, under the pretext of fighting terrorism, killed thousands of Tamils, including children, who were sent to a small strip of land designated as a safe zone, where they were then bombed. Atrocities evidenced by satellite photographs. The Easter Sunday atrocities in 2019, and despite intelligence warning of the attacks, has still not seen anybody brought to justice. Now, all of these scars are deepened... Yes, certainly.
For giving way, and the experiences he describes are very well known to many of the Tamil constituents that I am lucky enough to represent. In particular, can I ask you about the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which is still in force today in Sri Lanka, and which is used arbitrarily as a means to discriminate against and intimidate the remaining Tamil community in Sri Lanka. Does he share my view that it is high time the British government took more decisive action to put pressure on the Sri Lankan government to end the use of that act?
I thank the Honourable Member for that intervention. We are on exactly the same page, although I will come to that section of my speech fairly shortly. I agree absolutely wholeheartedly with the comments that he has made. As I was saying, these scars are deepened by the fact that years later, the Sri Lankan Tamil communities are no closer to any meaningful accountability or justice for these terrible pogroms, and by the fact that many of the institutions and laws which enabled the violence remain in place today, and they are still responsible for the human rights violations occurring. Concerns remain about Sri Lanka's police force and armed forces, with allegations that they abuse their power in relation to surveilling and harassing human rights activists. Indeed, I have heard directly from Tamils that the outcome of the Sri Lankan Lessons Learned Reconciliation Commission was that the victims were further victimised by the Sri Lankan armed forces. Concerns remain too about the laws which enable human rights violations. The Prevention of Terrorism Act, which my colleague had asked about, has enabled the detention of political prisoners for long periods since it was enacted in 1979. It was this act which was used to detain the 53 prisoners at Welikada prison who were subsequently killed during a terrible flashpoint in the Black July pogrom, which has come to be remembered as the Welikada prison massacre. The Prevention of Terrorism Act was used to arrest state opponents, and although it may now be repealed, there are fears that its proposed replacement, the Anti-Terror Act, may in fact be worse, and that the government's attitude towards human rights activists has not altered at all. Domestic attempts at accountability for the events of 1983, meanwhile, would appear to have failed. The Presidential Truth Commission on Ethnic Violence published its report in 2002, criticising the government for failing to hold perpetrators to account and for failing to appeal for restraint during Black July. The report recognised the pogrom as a violation of Tamil human rights and recommended compensation for the victims. However, the recommendations of this report have never been properly implemented, and not a single perpetrator has ever been prosecuted. The Sri Lankan government are now implementing another Truth and Reconciliation Commission. However, concerns remain that this provides no route to accountability and no proper witness protection mechanism. This would neither cater to the victims' needs nor adhere to international standards. Now, I am grateful to the Sri Lankan High Commission for providing me with a briefing update on reconciliation. It will take me some time to fully digest and consider the points made. However, I would like to highlight one of the first sections, the Office of Missing Persons, OMP. It states that the tracing unit found 16 persons alive and confirmed 3 deceased as of November 2023. And let me put that into context. It is believed that some 18,000 Tamils had been handed over to the army. So what happened to the rest? Where are they? And what records exist to tell us? Amnesty International identified that despite global pressure, serious human rights violations committed during the years of armed conflict remain unaddressed. The families of those forcibly disappeared continue to seek truth and justice. Now, these are facts which the UK government know and recognise. In the FCDO's 2022 Human Rights and Democracy report, the government noted that the Prevention of Terrorism Act was used to detain Sri Lankans for long periods, and that the UK continued to call for the government of Sri Lanka to replace the PTA with human rights compliant legislation. The report also noted that security forces faced accusations of serious human rights violations. The government concluded that there has been little credible progress on transitional justice before promising that the UK will continue to advocate for improved protection of human rights in Sri Lanka. Yes, certainly.
And congratulate him on securing this important debate, which many of my constituents would also concur with concerns about human rights violations, including access to clean drinking water as a human rights violation. Does he share my concerns of reports that the Sri Lankan government has refused to allow independent assessments of water quality in northern Sri Lanka, and agree that the Sri Lankan government must ensure all citizens of that region, who are mostly Tamils, have access to clean drinking water, and anyone affected by contamination be provided with medical care and be compensated adequately, as a little known but very important human rights violation as well?
I'm grateful for the honourable member making that point. You're correct, it is little known, and you have educated myself in making it. I would concur with your assessment, and it's, as is often the case, it is the poorest and least advantaged that are most disadvantaged in these situations. As I was saying, as a broad statement of intent, the government's position is welcome. However, the UK could and should go further. The Sri Lanka Campaign for Peace and Justice has called for the Sri Lankan government to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act and revoke the proposed Anti-Terrorism Act, ensuring that all anti-terror legislation adheres to international standards. to establish independent mechanisms with prosecutorial powers to hold the police, armed forces and government departments to account for human rights abuses, to incorporate Black July and other root causes of the ethnic conflict into its public education system, and to work with the Tamil community and with international experts to find a real political solution to the ethnic conflict which is acceptable to Tamils on the island. As a UN member state and an ally of Sri Lanka, I would urge that the UK does more to support these calls for accountability, for justice and for human rights protections, so there may be lasting peace and reconciliation. Exact numbers are unclear, but more than 100,000 people, including 40,000 civilians, according to a United Nations panel, may have been killed during the conflict. Ultimately, there must be a right to self-determination for the Tamils. Everyone should be able to live without fear according to their customs and traditions. There is much that could be done, and I look forward to hearing the Minister's response to this debate. I hope that it will consider officially recognising the atrocities committed as genocide, and will look at introducing sanctions against the known perpetrators, whom to date have escaped being held to account and has denied justice to the victims. Canada and the US have already sanctioned some war criminals. It's high time that the UK was doing the same. Yes, certainly.
Very grateful for the Honourable Gentleman to give way. He's very right at the point to suggest that the UK government should copy what Canada and the United States have done. Does he share my concern that we need greater openness and transparency about the role of the current Foreign Secretary before his appointment, when he was known to be lobbying for the port city in Colombo and has done a lot of work with China and Sri Lanka? Does he agree with me that we need a lot more openness to know that the British Foreign Office is taking this issue seriously and listening to Parliament and to British Tamils?
I thank the honourable member for that, and I would agree entirely. I'm grateful for him making that point, which fits in nicely to some of the comments I have on some of the other aspects. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights recommended that states, including the UK, sanction key human rights perpetrators such as General Silva and other alleged perpetrators in Sri Lanka. By sanctioning individuals responsible for perpetrating crimes against the Tamils, the UK government would support UN and US action in demonstrating that alleged perpetrators of mass atrocities are not welcome here in the UK. Recently, the PM's trade envoy went to Sri Lanka. Encouraging trade without demanding human rights gives the wrong signal to the world, in my opinion. We should be using our influence more effectively. Now, I hope that the September 2024 will see the UN Human Rights Council resolution, which is due to expire, replaced with a new and stronger resolution. Would the Minister agree with me that this should include referring the issue to the UN General Council with the object of achieving a mechanism to bring perpetrators to justice and achieve a permanent political solution going forward? If we are serious about safeguarding the Tamils in Sri Lanka, the legacy of disenfranchisement, deportation and discrimination must be replaced by the principles of peace and democracy. Thank you.
Here, here. Okay.
Rights. Dame Maria Miller.
Thank you, Sir Edward, and it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I congratulate the honourable member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for securing this debate today. And I very much welcome the opportunity to contribute, particularly looking at the importance of human rights in Sri Lanka and speaking up for my constituents that still have close links to the Sri Lankan Tamil community. Because wherever we are in the world, Sir Edward, belonging to whatever religion or race, all people deserve to live in peace and safety without discrimination or violence. And this isn't the case for so many Tamils who still live in Sri Lanka. Quite rightly, Sri Lanka is one of the UK's 32 human rights priority countries as identified by the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. And in that department's annual report on human rights and democracy, It has been said that minority communities face continued marginalisation by state authorities, state-supported land appropriation, so-called land grabs sparked concerns over their impact on particularly those communities in the north and the east, and impact on freedom of religious belief, freedom of belief of non-Buddhist denominations. So there is a great deal of understanding in the FCDO about the situation on the ground, and that, coupled with concerns around security forces continuing to disrupt Tamil commemorative events for victims of Sri Lanka's armed conflict, and arbitrarily accusing Tamils of links to terrorist organisations. This indicates to me, Sir Edward, that the government is very aware of what is going on the ground in Sri Lanka, and particularly the remarks around the challenges faced by activists and families of those of the disappeared in the northeast. And those that have faced surveillance, harassment and intimidation by the security forces. So it would appear to me that there is a great understanding here, and this debate today gives my right honourable friend the Minister, my fellow Hampshire MP, the opportunity to perhaps update the House on the sort of actions that are being taken to take this understanding and to turn it into some support on the ground. We've heard, Sir Edward, reports of Tamils living in Sri Lanka being subject to discrimination and threats of violence, as well as being subject to the arrests under the Prevention of Terrorism Act on relatively weak grounds. We also know that Tamils have, on occasions, not been allowed to attend memorials for those killed or lost during the Civil War, which is a vital part of community healing. And back in 2011, we heard from the UK panel of experts that there were credible allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And the fact that these have not been fully investigated or charged or prosecuted has, I believe, diminished the ability of the country to reconcile from the events of the past. Whenever these sorts of events occur, it's so important that well thought through reconciliation is put in place, and particularly when it comes to looking at the situation in Sri Lanka. It's so important for stability and peace in Sri Lanka that there is reconciliation of the actions of the past, and that appropriate justice is delivered where it's required. And above all, that the discrimination that we've seen ends. The National Unity and Reconciliation Commission that was established earlier this year felt like a step in the right direction, but many organisations, including Amnesty International, have expressed significant concern that this would not be sufficient. In Sri Lanka, we need to make sure that the Commission does what it needs to do with real reconciliation that has a genuine chance of starting the healing across communities that will bring the whole country together. The first step must be to end all discrimination against Tamils in Sri Lanka. They deserve to be able to live out their own culture and religious practices in peace without interference from other groups. The government and my right honourable friend, the Minister, continues, I know, to work hard to keep very strong relationships with Sri Lanka, which is important for the future of all the communities there and important for promoting peace and human rights. They are clearly putting plans in place. In 2022 to 2025, the Conflict Stability and Security Fund for Sri Lanka from the FCDO supports human rights priorities with more than £11 million. And UK funding for the United Nations Development Programme has also supported the resettlement of displaced communities of land cleared of mines. So it's important that we continue to work with countries like Sri Lanka, and I'm aware that the government is consistently reviewing its global sanctions list. So I'm sure the Minister will want to take the opportunity presented today to perhaps update the House on what the approach is to sanctions. And I'm sure my constituents and people back in Sri Lanka will also be taking note of the comments that he makes. I'm sure my right honourable friend will be listening carefully to the views of members in this debate because equality and freedom from discrimination is not only important to the people in this room but to every single member of this House of Commons. And wherever people live in the world, they deserve to have support from the United Kingdom in their bid to make sure that they live free and equal lives. The UK must, above all else, champion human rights and promote peace across the world, which I hope we will continue to do in Sri Lanka, so that one day all communities there will be able to live in peace and prosperity. Thank you.
John MacDonald.
Thank you, Sir Edward. I want to congratulate the honourable gentleman, not just for securing the debate, but setting the scene so well. I just want to say briefly, I just want to ask the question, how many more times do we have to be here and debate this issue before the UK plays its full role in securing justice for the Tamil community? There's other members in this chamber who, like me, have been around a long while in this issue. I can remember before 2009, but also I do remember 2009 distinctly. There's already, the calculation is over 70,000 at least were unaccounted for. Some of them disappeared. One of my constituents went back to Sri Lanka to try and find his family, and he was disappeared as well. We've never heard from him since. I've received the briefing from the Sri Lankan government, as others have as well, and I've tried to examine that briefing in relation to what I believe is the reality on the ground. There are claims from the Sri Lankan government that a process of reconciliation is taking place and that arrangements have been put in place that will ensure the protection of human rights and civil liberties. That's certainly not the reports that we get from our constituents who have families back in Sri Lanka. And the examples, just very briefly, the recent ones we've been told is Tamil Remembrance Day, in which people were arrested, detained, and then memorials were smashed as well. That doesn't sound like the protection of civil liberties or respect to be meted out to the Tamil community. The use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act has been a continuous abuse, to be frank, and the recent death of, I hope I've got the pronunciation right, the young man Nakarasa Alex, who was detained and died in custody, is another example that the use of detention in this way has resulted, and we know in some instances of torture claims that have taken place.
I thank my friend for giving way on this point and the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act. I went to Sri Lanka on a delegation in 1984 and raised with the then President Jayawardena the human rights system, the abuse of human rights and the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And I've met many Sri Lankan families who have people missing from that period on. And unless they get closure and an understanding what's happened to them, the horror for individual families will just go on. And I'm sure my friend who represents many Tamil people would endorse the need for us to get an open book on everything that's happened to every person that disappeared.
My honourable friend evidences the long history of this, but the long history of the use of the PTA to detain, the use of the PTA of example after example of torture, but also deaths in custody as well. And from what we hear, the new legislation that's being proposed actually might be worse than the PTA itself. That's the problem that we have. Can I also say the issue that comes up time and time again within the Tamil community in my constituency is the continued militarisation of their Tamil lands and the way in which that land is being used. And I think we have to recognise the operation of the military within Sri Lanka. The military aren't just a military establishment. They're a whole industry in themselves and profiteering at the expense often of the Tamils community, and in particular at the expense of the seizure of the Tamil lands themselves. And the process of demilitarisation has hardly been evidenced by the Sri Lankan government. But I just want to say that actually, why is this happening? Why is the Sri Lankan government continuing to operate with impunity? Well, I actually do think it's a collective failure by the international community, and that includes the United Kingdom as well. We haven't done enough to pressurise the Sri Lankan government. So we have not taken the action I thought we were going to take with regard to the targeting of those identified abusing human rights and effectively war criminals as well, in a way that we've done with other countries. So the use of the Magnitsky Clause, I don't believe, from what I've seen or from the evidence we've had, there hasn't been a single use of Magnitsky to sanction the human rights abusers from Sri Lanka. And let's congratulate the USA and Canada who have. We should be following their example. With regard to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that's been established anew, I think this is the 15th, is it, or 16th that's taken place. What we were pressing for before was this should be an independent, international convened commission, not one that's just in-house, almost the country market its own homework. And finally, we did raise the issue before about the reference to the International Criminal Court, because it's quite clear during that period, certainly in 2009, there were offences against the Rome Statute that could be constituted as war crimes. I believe that what we should do now is maximise the pressure that we can put on the Sri Lankan government. We should now look at the use of sanctions. We should look at the review of all the bilateral relationships that we have with Sri Lanka. And in particular, we've raised this before. I don't believe we should have given Sri Lanka the benefit of the country's trading scheme status and the concessions that they have. This is the only way, I believe, that will be influence the Sri Lankan government to abide by some, at least the commitments that they've given us with regard to the protection of human rights and civil liberties, and respect for the rights of the Tamil community overall.
Limit their remarks to 5 to 6 minutes, please. Elliot Coleman.
Member for Lithgow and East Falkirk for bringing this debate forward, and it's great to see so many members of the APPG for Tamils, which I'm proud to be the chair of, here participating in today's debate. I also received the Sri Lankan ambassador's briefing in advance of this debate, along with an invitation to meet, but given that his predecessor frequently referred to myself and members of the APPG as white tigers, I think I'll be washing my hair that day. The case, I think, has already been compellingly put by colleagues that have already spoken, but just to reiterate some of the harrowing facts. In 2009, for example, tens of thousands of Tamils perished in the Mullawaikal genocide, with many still unaccounted for. And the Sri Lankan government's continued denial of war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide does necessitate the need for international intervention. We've already heard from other members about militarisation, arbitrary arrests under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, rising anti-Tamil nationalism, and the absence of long-term solutions. And in recent months, even in the years that have preceded 2009, all of the promises that have been made by the Sri Lankan government, all the promises that were made under UN human rights resolutions have failed to come to anything. And militarisation is one of those areas where I think that the UK could go further, because militarisation does remain pervasive. 16 out of the 20 military divisions in the island are in the north and the east, otherwise known as in Tamil areas. And demilitarisation is crucial to securing and fostering a sustainable and lasting peace. And to do that, I know that the referral to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout after Sri Lanka's economy crashed could not be linked to human rights. But what it can do is put certain conditions on government spending. And one of the things I think we should absolutely be pushing for is to the reduction in military spending as a result of the IMF bailout. That must be a condition of that money. But there has also been calls for a consistent long-term solution. And I would like to ask the Minister for an update on the mechanism that was secured at the last UN Human Rights Council, 30.1, which for the first time allowed the international community to collect new information. It was a resolution that I know the UK pushed for very hard, and I do want to welcome the efforts that the FCDO put into securing that resolution. But as we've heard, it is up next year, and could I please get an update from the Minister on what he anticipates the UK may be in a position to do when we've had an opportunity to review that new information, to take further action and go forward.
My honourable friend, give
I'll
way.
gladly give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Now, a number of councillors, Councillor Paramnanda, Councillor Jay Ganesh, Nick Rogers and London Assembly, have pushed local authorities to celebrate Tamil Heritage Month, which is next month, and that allows children to celebrate speaking Tamil, the oldest language still in use, and sing songs, Tamil songs, dances, poetry, etc. But part of their heritage is this awful chapter. My honourable friend talked about these resolutions, as did the honourable member who opened the debate. And does he agree with me that rather than waiting for a third resolution, the first of which was backed by Sri Lanka itself, we can actually get some action done rather than having to keep renewing with no action?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend and my predecessor as chair of the APPG on Tamils for that intervention, and he's absolutely right. And I think just in closing, I think the last action that I think the government must urgently look at and review is the issue of sanctions, especially sanctions against those who are credibly accused of war crimes, particularly General Silva, but not just General Silva, many others as well. It's been said already that we are lagging behind the US and Canada, who have already implemented these sorts of sanctions, and I think it is time that the UK follows suit and implements them without any further delay. And as we approach the 15th anniversary of the end of the war, I do hope that the Minister can give us some reassurances that the UK will continue to stand in solidarity with the Tamil community in demanding justice and accountability. The diplomatic efforts and the internal efforts in Sri Lanka have not brought about meaningful change or any lasting peace, and the Tamil community's quest for justice and peace must not be deterred. So it's time for us to follow the international community, impose those sanctions and continue to lead the way in standing up for the rights of Tamil people.
Maybe.
Thank you. Can I contribute to the member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for securing this debate and join other honourable members in raising the plight of Tamil people over many, many years. Like others, I've been involved in these debates in this House all too frequently. I've tracked this in some detail over the last 26 years as my constituents in Kingston, Surbiton, indeed round South West London, who are British Tamils, have come to me with their concerns with what's happening to their families and their communities. And it's been a very painful episode and continues to be, frankly, even worse than I can ever remember it. The economic crisis in Sri Lanka, with the corruption of the government there, has just made things even worse for both the Sinhalese and Tamil and Muslim communities in that island. But the Tamil people, particularly in the northeast, are suffering under the militarisation, under the land grabs, under the arbitrary detention and arrest, a whole series of injustices and human rights abuses which this House is right to focus on.
Will the right honourable member give way?
I have to give way.
I'm grateful to the right honourable member for giving way. And he mentions an important point that I think we do need to highlight there, which is that it isn't just the Tamil community, but indeed many minority groups on the island are facing human rights abuses. He mentions the Muslim community, and during the pandemic, the Muslim community was subject to forced cremations on the island. So I just wanted through that intervention make sure that we are making it fully aware to the government benches that it isn't just the Tamil community, it's in fact many minority groups that are suffering as a result of the regime.
I think that's right, and that exposes the regime in all its frankly, undemocratic and outrageous behaviour. I want to join other colleagues by saying the UK government can do more than it's done. It can follow US and China in sanctioning individuals. People have mentioned, quite rightly, General Silva, but there's also General Jayasuriya and others who were involved in those last few months of the war in 2009 who quite clearly committed war crimes. And it's beyond that. I would like to see the government, as others honourable members said, have used the IMF process to try to exert some leverage, use the work at the UN Human Rights Council to exercise more leverage. I think the trade deals is something we could use. When I was Trade Minister, I urged on the EU, as we were then in the European Union, not to give back what were called GSP plus concessions, and we won that argument in the Trade Council in Brussels, and those concessions were not given back to Sri Lanka. Regrettably, they were given back in 2016, and now, after Brexit, Sri Lanka benefits from trade and tariff concessions given by this government. I don't see why they should, and I think we ought to be demanding the repeal of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, security sector reforms, and the proper accountability before the Colombo government gets these benefits. But there was one particular issue I wanted to bring to this debate, Sir Edward, because it's not discussed enough in this context, and that's the role of China. The geopolitics of Sri Lanka need to be looked at with the growing role of China and, of course, the influence of India. And I think the UK, the European Union, North America, and elsewhere have been remiss in engaging in this debate from that geopolitical stance. And we see what's happened because of the vacuum that's been left. We've seen China invest over the last almost 2 decades in the harbour called Hambantota in the south of the island. And that's, yes, it's got trade advantages for China, and there are many other countries who use that port. But there is no doubt it's a significant strategic investment by China, not just for trade purposes, but potentially for military purposes, given the significance of that port controlling the sea lanes and shipping routes to the south. And China has a 99-year lease on that port. And it's actually indebted the Sri Lankan government, and we're seeing what's sometimes called a debt trap diplomacy, where China is, through the debt and influence it has on the Sri Lankan economy and Sri Lankan politics, is using that more and more. And we're now seeing it with the second big port development. It's actually bigger than a port, it's a city. It's called Port City Colombo, Sir Edward, on hundreds of acres of land that have been reclaimed from the sea in Colombo. And again, China is taking a long-term lease on that, and is essentially a Chinese-owned, government-owned company is developing that. And one surely should be asking about the ability of the UK, the EU, North America, our Indian allies, to try to respond to this. I think this is quite a serious geopolitical development. The Tamil people, who are the subject of this debate, their human rights are disregarded by the Chinese who are interfering in Sri Lankan politics. But if we are going to support those Tamil people and support what I would say all people on the island of Sri Lanka, we've got to ask some hard questions about how we respond to this hard power and soft power being exercised by the Chinese government. We've been too naive for far too long, and if we're serious about wanting to influence what's happening on the island of Sri Lanka, we've got to get serious about our diplomacy in New Delhi and in Beijing. And I would ask the Minister, in replying to this debate, if he can say a little bit about the government's thinking in this area, and whether he and I would urge the Foreign Secretary prepared to meet cross-party MPs to discuss this, because I realise some of this may be very sensitive. And in my intervention to the mover of this debate, I mentioned the Foreign Secretary's previous activities prior to his appointment. Now, I'm sure he acted with integrity, but the Minister must realise that people outside this debate, listening in, the British Tamil community and the diaspora and Tamils in Sri Lanka want to know what the British Foreign Secretary is going to think and say and do about the situation in Sri Lanka, whether it's with respect to India or China or the Colombo government themselves. Given that, in January this year, he was visiting Port City Colombo, trying to get investment, supporting the Chinese investment there. I think it's a legitimate question for this House to ask. And I'm sure there are answers. And I'm sure we can be transparent about those. But if we are going to play a role, as the UK, this Parliament's going to play its role influencing the government, we need to understand that because of the centrality of China to the future of Sri Lanka, and indeed, I would argue, to improving the justice for the Tamil people and the human rights for the Tamil people. Thank you, Sir Edward.
Anna Davey.
Thank you, Sir Edward Lee. It's a pleasure to speak in this debate, and I congratulate the member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for securing this important debate. In Lewisham East, I represent a significant number of residents from the Tamil community. And since being an MP, I've written to foreign secretaries, and I've attended several events all relating to human rights abuses committed against Tamils. I'm also an officer of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Tamils. Sri Lanka is a beautiful country that one day I hope to visit, but yet it has experienced, as we've already heard, a cycle of violence and since its independence in 1948. As everyone in this debate will know, in 2009, Sri Lankan civil war came to an end when the Tamil Tigers were defeated by the Sri Lankan armed forces. The Sri Lankan government in power at that time denied accusations of crimes made against the military and civilian government. Yet there have been allegations of violence against women and girls, of sexual violence being used as a vicious weapon of war, of rape and the most heinous of crimes, some beyond my imagination, like cutting off women's breasts. It was therefore disappointing that in February 2020, the Sri Lankan government withdrew its support for a UN-led reconciliation process that would investigate and prosecute war-related crimes. Whilst in May 2023, the new government announced that it was establishing a National Unity and Reconciliation Commission. However, organisations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the International Crisis Group, as well as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights have all questioned whether this will achieve anything and for the victims to receive justice. For a long time now, my constituents have lobbied me over reported human rights abuses in Sri Lanka. The Prevention of Terrorist Act, PTA, has enabled arbitrary arrest, detention without charge or evidence, forced confessions and torture of anyone suspected of terrorism. Whilst there have been amendments to this Act, Amnesty International has stated that Muslims and Tamil minorities remain disproportionately affected by the use of the PTA. This must be addressed and tackled. I'm pleased that my party, the Labour Party, has recommitted itself to securing justice for the survivors, whose families suffered such grave human rights violations. The UK Government must follow the recommendations of the UN High Commissioner to refer the perpetrators of these atrocities to the International Criminal Court. And while we are waiting for this, the political and economic crisis facing Sri Lankans remain deeply concerning alongside humanitarian needs and the geopolitical challenges in the region. In conclusion, accountability for past and reported current crimes is crucial to achieving political sustainability, as is the justice for the affected Tamil victim survivor community. I look forward to the Minister's response.
Gilbert MacDonald.
Thank you, Sir Edward, and congratulations on having this debate. In Easter 2009, I spent my time out on Parliament Square watching an entire community, the Tamil community in London, aside itself with grief as news of relatives, of friends, of communities being bombed, their hospitals being bombed, of people lying on the beach unable to be removed by members of their family or community because the democratically elected Sri Lankan government was dropping cluster bombs on its own people. At that time, I spent my time taking students, London Tamil students, to see the Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, in order to try and prevent some of them taking some drastic action and committing suicide. In those 13 years, how much has changed? The attitude of always negotiating, always talking, always being calm, doing nothing, negotiating. Negotiating what for? Those hundreds of thousands of people have still not been found. Not one person committing a war crime has been prosecuted. There are no more answers than there were before. Now has come the time for the Foreign Office to decide whether it's still going to carry on with the mealy-mouthed diplomacy it has always sought, or actually take action. Use some of the laws that Parliament has given them to take action against those who have perpetrated war crimes. Our Foreign Secretary needs to seriously come forward and be honest about his role in trying to promote the Chinese government's plan for a new port in Colombo. It does not bode well. Let us show Sri Lankans and Tamils differently. Let's take a different path and actually get some movement on progress.
Antari.
It's an honour to serve under your chairships, Edward, and I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for securing this debate. As we've just heard from my Honourable friend for Hayes and Harlington and Honourable friend for Mitcham Morden, there are so many times that people have been in this room, not just over the past few years, but over decades, calling for the same things, and yet the government is continually failing to act. In my constituency, there are hundreds of people from the Tamil community who've written into me just in the last few days, asking me to speak today because they are concerned deeply about their families' futures in northeast Sri Lanka. Many have written to me about this. Last week, thousands of Tamils in Sri Lanka and around the world commemorated their war dead in the Martyn Day. But once again, Tamils mourning Sri Lanka faced oppression, a violent crackdown from the Sri Lankan state apparatus in their attempts to remember their war dead, as they visited the remains of the Tamil cemeteries that the Sri Lankan government had already bulldozed. As many as 11 Tamils, including a young schoolboy, were arrested by Sri Lankan authorities after Sri Lankan authorities stormed those remembrance events. The UN has always been clear that Tamils have a fundamental right to remember their war dead on November the 27th, and that any attempt to infringe on this is a clear violation of international law. This is yet another reminder of the daily injustices inflicted on the Tamil people of Sri Lanka. It's now nearly 15 years since the end of the armed conflict. Tamils in Sri Lanka are facing an onslaught from their government, increasing reports of land grabs, the destruction of Tamil places of worship, and the illegal construction of Buddhist viharas. Tamils and Muslims on the island face horrific state-led abuses. Among these abuses are continued use, as many colleagues have said today, of the Draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act, the continued use of torture, of sexual violence, and the extrajudicial killings by Sri Lanka's security forces. Efforts to stifle Tamil voices in Sri Lanka have grown increasingly bold, as seen through the arrest of the Tamil MP Silvarasa Kiranjan. He was detained by the police for commemorating the hunger strike unto death taken by Philippan, who demanded the right of self-autonomy for the Tamil people. The increasingly violent anti-Tamil nationalist rhetoric continues to be popularised by every single Sri Lankan policymaker. It is vile ethnic nationalist ideology that continues to echo through those corridors of power. It shapes the policies and the government in ways that marginalise further the Tamil people. And let's be clear, Sri Lanka has a military that's almost double the size of the UK's military. Over 75% of that, though, is deployed in the traditional Tamil homelands. And this, of course, perpetuates a climate of intimidation, human rights abuses, and brutalises the nascent Tamil economy. A variety of UN bodies, from Human Rights Watch as well, and other human rights organisations, have called for justice for the victims of the historic and present atrocities inflicted upon the Tamil people. Many of those accused, far from being prosecuted, have been rewarded with lucrative promotions, most notably the appointment of General Shavendra Silva to the head of the Sri Lankan Armed Forces, a total and utter disgrace. In 2015, through investigation by the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, the strong and corroborated evidence of the 58th Division, led by Silva, had extrajudicially executed surrendering soldiers and shelled marked civilian hospitals. For the healing process to begin for the Tamil people, said Edward, monsters like Silva must face justice and be removed from the positions of power where they can continue to abuse the Tamil people. And around the world, as we've heard today, policymakers need to be forceful in bringing forward the sanctions that would actually make a difference. We've seen increasingly calls for sanctions against Sri Lankan war criminals. In Canada, they recently sanctioned several individuals, including the former presidents Gotabaya and Mahinda Rajapaksa, for their role in the war crimes against humanity, and genocide committed against the Tamils in the north and east of Sri Lanka. Canada's Parliament also groundbreakingly unanimously recognised Tamil genocide in a landmark motion, the first recognition of its kind anywhere in the world. The United States has also issued sanctions on General Silva, and in a recent letter to Secretary of State Blinken, several congressmen and women from across the aisle urged the State Department to end the diplomatic impunity enjoyed by Sri Lankan perpetrators of human rights abuses. And despite this, the UK is yet to sanction a single alleged Sri Lankan war criminal. In fact, in the past few years, the UK has provided several million in security assistance to Sri Lanka to aid training and capacity building for the Sri Lankan police and security forces. Now, given these troubling reports, Sir Edward, I'd like to hear from the Minister a commitment to publish an assessment of the impact of the financial support and the full overseas security and justice assistance assessments for activities under this programme to reassure this House that the UK is not contributing to serious human rights violations, as I've previously raised in the House on a number of occasions. The UK's failure to sanction the Sri Lankan military and government officials who are credibly accused of war crimes against humanity and genocide is hampering now international efforts for justice and accountability and rightly enraging the Tamil diaspora around the world. Sir Edward, too many lives have been lost in Sri Lanka's ethnic conflict. Britain has a historic role in the root cause of this ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka due to our dark colonial past on the island and our failure to maintain governance structures that allowed different communities to coexist peacefully on the island. So it is in Britain's duty, in my view, to play a huge and important leading role in supporting the Tamil community as they seek a peaceful political solution in Sri Lanka that meets the aspirations of all people on that island, including the Tamil people's aspirations for self-determination.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Sir Edward. It is indeed a pleasure to serve under your chairship. Can I first of all congratulate the honourable gentleman for Lieutenant Gow and East Falkirk for securing the debate and for setting the scene so very well, and for by his leading the debate he's helped us all to participate. The situation of human rights in Sri Lanka is one which has continually drawn my attention during my time as a Member of Parliament. Unfortunately, the human rights violations of the Sri Lankan civil war have yet to be properly addressed by the Sri Lankan government, nor have many perpetrators, indeed any perpetrators, been brought to justice. Some of those perpetrators continue to hold governmental positions, while reform efforts have had little effect. The Tamil population continues to suffer under governmental restrictions and human rights violations, including disappearances and death. These issues, Sir Edward, and many others have been well documented by the United Nations, and clearly there is a need for reform. I think that's what we're all asking for, and asking for our Minister and our government to be very active. The European Union helped us amend some changes during their talks. However, the amendments to the Prevention of Terrorism Act have done little to improve the human rights situation of the Tamils and other affected parties. I'd like to focus, if I can, my time on the Prevention of Terrorism Act. The others have spoken about it, or the PTA as I refer to it, and its effects on the Tamil minority religious communities. The honourable gentleman who intervened earlier on referred to the minority religious minorities. I'm going to give some examples, if I can, of all the minorities that are suffering as a result. Freedom of religion or belief is a vital component of the human rights landscape throughout the world. FORB and other human rights are integrally intertwined. They're like two fingers rolled over each other. Human rights and persecution of religious belief march hand in hand. Through the oppression of one human right, all others suffer. I'm chair of the APPG and Freedom of Religious Belief, and I want to talk about that if I can. The PTA has been a tool of the Sri Lankan government to wrongfully detain, oppress political, cultural and religious outliers since its inception in 1979. Of course, the country has a right and a duty to protect its citizens against terrorism and violence. It does not, however, Sir Edward, have the right to wrongfully imprison its own citizens without just cause, nor does it allow for any violations of human rights. The environment of fear and oppression which the PTA has helped to form leads to divisive rhetoric, oft-times grouping together minority populations with the Tamil population centred in the north as a common target. This phenomenon is compounded by the fact that many religious populations are represented in the Tamil population at a much higher rate. These sociological aspects of the situation are important to note because they strongly contributed to the political and cultural dynamic of the region. Violence directed against religious groups, such as the Easter Sunday attacks of 2019, are red flag markers of the aspect of the situation. Other religious minorities are targeted. I've had the chance to meet with some human rights campaigners working on the ground in Sri Lanka who have described the situation of minority religious groups, including the Hindus, the Christians and the Muslims, as one of fear and bureaucratic oppression. New laws make the building of religious structures more difficult, which is particularly harmful for members of religions, many of whom tend to come from less prosperous socio-economic backgrounds. Local bureaucracy can prove to be a major stumbling block for minority religious communities, many members of which are Tamil. Police members of nationalist Buddhist groups and others cause difficulties and harass the worshippers, often leading to meeting supervision. COVID-19 protection laws, which required forced cremations of all burials, forced Muslims to violate Islamic religious observance standards, the very key and core of their beliefs. Thankfully, this policy has come to an end, but other measures remain in place for the oppression of Muslim community members. Per the United States Centre for Religious Freedom's 2022 report on Sri Lanka, Hindu and Muslim sites in the predominantly Tamil Northern Province have been destroyed under the oversight of government agencies, creating space for the building of Buddhist temples. The report notes that this practice was one of the biggest impediments to religious freedom in the Northern Province. So what can the UK government do? What can our minister do? What can our government do? We've seen that bilateral talks can be effective in promoting change, but only to a limited extent. Excuse me. Sri Lanka's economic dependence on the European market was a key point to its PTA reform process. Perhaps that pressure could be put on again. However, these reforms are not adequate to protect human rights in the country. A new strategy is needed, combining bilateral and multilateral efforts. The same is true in international organisations such as the UN. The UK is a leader in human rights advocacy worldwide. Let us use this position to take a stand for the rights of our brothers and our sisters in Sri Lanka, who we all are speaking for here today. When international pressure is applied, Sir Edward, states take note. I have seen this happen throughout the world, and again we ask for our minister and our government to do the same. Just to say, in conclusion, it's very important to speak on this topic. Discussions like these are the vital parts of the UK's response to injustice and suffering throughout the world. It is encouraging to see debates like this. This week and next, we note the 75th anniversaries of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. It's very clear to me, Sir Edward, that genocide has taken place against the Tamil population, ethnic minorities, religious groups, to such an extent that many of the people, and indeed the Honourable Jennifer Hayes in Harrington referred to some people from his constituency who went to look for some of their constituents or their family members and couldn't find them. There is injustice to be addressed. So I'd hope that these commemorations inspire an increased effort to promoting human rights domestically and throughout the world. I look very much forward to what the Minister will say, and also to the two shadow ministers who I know will encapsulate all the things that we wish to see. And what we really want to see is justice. And that's, at this moment in time, we don't see that.
Anne McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I congratulate my friend, the Honourable Member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk, and I thank him on behalf of all my Tamil friends and colleagues for bringing this debate back here. It really does matter a lot to people, and I think he knows that. It would be easy to say Sri Lanka has been debated and to move on, so I'm really pleased that this place is clearly going to be talking about this until something changes. And I also pay tribute to all the familiar faces in here today. I know their consistent commitment makes a big difference to people. Mr Chairman, I want to start by saying that it is a crime against humanity itself that nobody has been found accountable since this war ended years ago. There has been a sleight of hand performance between then and now, with different Sri Lankan governments promising the international community and their own people that they'll do X, Y and Z, then drawing back, then promising again. But at the end of the day, progress is never made, accountability never happens, reconciliation is never credibly attempted, and peace never really comes to this beautiful island. Mr Chair, I've just repeated the words I used in a speech on this issue in March 2021. I wasn't being lazy. I just wanted to do that to show that it's incredible that I can do that, because 2.5 years on, the situation remains almost exactly the same. But perhaps we shouldn't be surprised, because the Civil War did start 40 years ago, and as the Honourable Member for Linlithgow and Falkirk East told us, the issues that led to the war date back some many more years. So in the scheme of things, the last 2.5 years since I last stood and spoke in a debate here about this is minuscule compared to the length of time Tamil people have been waiting for justice.
That day, Mr Chair, I went on to talk about my time in Sri Lanka, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time doing that now because it is an incredible island, and it's an island that never seems to get a break. From the 30-year civil war that we're talking about today to the tsunami of 2004 that saw the deaths of an estimated 227,898 people, the flooding in 2017 that saw hundreds dead and thousands displaced, and the Easter Sunday attack in 2019 that others have spoken of. The people of Sri Lanka, as I say, never seem to get a break, and yet they just get on with it. Whether they're Tamil or Sinhala, there is a fortitude in the people of Sri Lanka that they accept the situation and make what they can of it. Best not to look back, one woman told me as we chatted about her new life in the US, years after her entire family were wiped out by that tsunami. I admired her greatly, and everyone must do what feels right for them, but I can't say I agreed with her philosophy. It's healthy to look back. It's necessary to look back, as long as there's a purpose to that. In the case of what we're talking about today, there is most definitely a purpose. Accountability and truth is essential to reconciliation. So I spent a very short 3 months in Sri Lanka during the Civil War. It was 2008, and I was part of the Scottish Government-funded post-tsunami economic redevelopment programme. I've returned on a number of occasions, and I'm in touch today with Sinhala and Tamil friends in Sri Lanka and here. In addition to that, I was elected to the Scottish Parliament in 2009, and because I had talked about being in Sri Lanka, many Tamil constituents got in touch with me about being unable to contact their families trapped in IDP camps. It was round about then that I realised how powerless many of us are, even when we are elected, when powerful people are determined to have their way. I stood at one point, believe it or not, at a buffet table of all things with the then President Mahinda Rajapaksa at his home, and I told him I was a member of the Scottish Parliament, and I asked him if he could please help me to find my constituents' loved ones in his IDP camps. I was dismissed and swept away by his people, and off he went to look for those who were happy to make small talk. I spent time in Trincomalee with a man so afraid of what might happen to me should I be caught reading his book about human rights abuses meted out to Tamils, that he removed the cover and replaced it with another to keep me safe. My constituents who'd sought asylum here told me more about those IDP camps, the missing people, those taken hostage. They were arrested but never tried, so in my book, they are hostages. The torture, the sexual violence, enforced disappearances, the shelling of the so-called no-fire zones. And we saw all this very well documented by the Channel 4 two-part documentary, Sri Lanka's Killing Fields, in 2011. The Tamil people cannot be expected to simply move on from that, particularly as we still don't know where all of those who went missing are. And I note what my honourable friend said about the numbers who've been found, according to the High Commissioner. 16 people have been traced alive and 3 dead. That's 19 people of the 18,000, as he said. So all these years later, we just have to find the 17,981 who are still missing. These are shocking statistics, but each of those numbers is a human being, part of a family, being desperately looked for by their loved ones, including the organisation called Mothers of the Disappeared. And they can't just move on. They can't just move on because, as we've also heard today, the worsening economic crisis in the country is leading to worsening human rights abuses. And they do not have to look back to injustices because they're still not getting justice today. Now, I acknowledge that all of this is the fault of the Sri Lankan government, although I acknowledge what has been said as well, and I agree with what's been said about our takeover of Sri Lanka. But the UK government, and I acknowledge that they've also played a vital role as leaders of the core group on Sri Lanka within the Human Rights Council. But I've stood here. We can't just pick and choose where we use our influence when it comes to human rights abuses. I've stood here in this place listening to Foreign Office ministers telling us, don't worry, it's all going to be okay. And I'm sure this is what's going to be told to us today. They will use their influence, etc., on the one hand. And on the other, telling us, as they did in a Westminster Hall debate here in 2015, that it was good news that Sirisena had become president because he wasn't Rajapaksa. But Sirisena had been part of the government when the Tamils were being ruthlessly bombarded, and he subsequently made said Rajapaksa Prime Minister before handing over the presidency to the other Rajapaksa. The Rajapaksa brothers are credibly accused of a host of war crimes during the war and of violating international humanitarian and human rights laws. So you could say the UK government has been too trusting, or you could say that they're doing nowhere near enough to use that influence to safeguard the rights of Tamil people in Sri Lanka. A couple of years ago, the then president pardoned a soldier, one of the few ever to be tried, never mind found guilty. This soldier was guilty of the killing of 8 Tamil civilians, including a 5-year-old child and 2 teenagers. I can only assume this was all part of his promise at the time to end what he called the era of betraying war heroes. Disgraceful. As the SNP spokesperson, I support calls from my honourable friend and other speakers, and I'm interested to hear answers from the Minister on the following. Will he refer the issue to the UN General Council with the object of achieving an international criminal court or other mechanism to bring perpetrators to justice? In terms of trade, does he agree that Sri Lanka should be removed from the enhanced framework until it meets the conditions already agreed to replace the Prevention of Terror Act with one that meets international standards, which is not what's happening? Will the Minister finally establish a screening policy for diplomatic meetings so that the UK is no longer giving legitimacy to individuals credibly accused of war crimes? And finally, Mr Chair, as just about everyone has asked, will he engage the global human rights sanctions regulations to apply sanctions against individuals credibly accused of involvement in mass atrocity crimes and human rights violations, as the US and Canada have done? It is, the very least, the victims of this war, both living and dead, both here and there, the very least that they can expect from us.
From the member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk, and those with extensive parliamentary experience, such as the member for Hayes and Harlington and Islington North, and of course the well-known and very active all-party group, which works across different groupings and parties, including the outstanding contribution from the member for Mitcham and Morden, who has done that casework day in, day out since 2009 in particular. I also want to put on record the work, the points that have been raised by the member for Ilford South and also for Lewisham, particularly as regards the humanitarian situation which is ongoing in the north of Sri Lanka, and also highlighted by the member for Putney, who talked about water quality, which of course is a very pressing concern for today. And we know, as friends of Sri Lankans and for the many diaspora who are in our communities and come to our advice surgeries with concerns about ongoing lack of consideration of what happened during that terrible period, that indeed, until this is really fully looked at and considered, there will be no peace. So my question really is to the Minister on the wide-ranging relationship which, of course, we have with Sri Lanka as a country. First of all, of course, putting on record the importance of the economic work done in the last 12 months since the sovereign debt crisis, the important work which the High Commission for Sri Lanka worked on with members from across the House to call for economic help for Sri Lanka in the last 12 months, but also that concern that we all have to marry that up with a socially just solution for those who feel that the true horrors of the civil war have not fully been heard. So I wonder, in that context of both the economic
imperatives and also the social justice concerns, whether the Minister might say in his concluding remarks what his view is around the role of the current Foreign Secretary, in particular his support for the port project in Sri Lanka, which of course he had a financial interest in, and what he feels as the Minister representing the government now to be the relationship between a state-owned enterprise and the Communist Party and the current Foreign Secretary, because I think the House does need to know whether the current Foreign Secretary had a financial relationship with a state-owned enterprise, which is basically a development company, or whether he thinks that was an acceptable relationship, and could he please enlighten the House? We also know, of course, that there are a number of important questions that need to be answered from the past, and whilst we warmly welcome a new announcement in May of this year that the Sri Lankan government will be undertaking a National Unity and Reconciliation Commission, we are also listening to NGOs which say that, such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, which was mentioned earlier in the debate, that there is a lack of genuine confidence in the milestones that need to be achieved towards the confidence that we can all have internationally in that commission. So I wonder whether the Minister might say to the House today whether he feels that this commission has achieved the milestones which would be expected between May and December of this year, so that we can all have confidence and we can give confidence to our constituents when they come and see us in our advice surgeries, and we can reassure them that the UK is playing its part to hold the government to account in Sri Lanka and to have a similar sort of process, such as what happened in South Africa, around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission there, which was actually held up to be a real gold standard of this sort of work. And I'll be very interested in hearing what the Minister's assessment of where we are at with that, given that now 8 months have gone by, and have we seen the sort of work that is needed in order to lead to the sort of outcome that we saw in South Africa. Of course, the UN panel of experts has expressed a desire to see credible evidence of the war crimes, and also to see that justice is served. And in particular, during this debate, we've heard a number of members underlining the role which General De Silva played during the conflict. And I wonder whether the Minister has made an assessment on whether the Magnitsky sanctions framework, which is post-Brexit one of our most important tools for holding to account the actions of certain individuals, whether he feels that this would fit into a potential Magnitsky sanction framework. Now, we're all aware that the standard response from a minister when asked this question is that we don't comment on these because that would then spoil the process of sanctions, because they're meant to be done sort of almost by surprise. But I wonder whether the Minister could hint to us in this House, as we're so concerned about this particular issue, what his particular view of that individual is, as his name does come up in so many of these representations at the UN panel of experts. I'm coming to an end, Sir Edward. I also wanted to ask whether he feels that there is a case to be answered based on his assessment of the evidence at the International Criminal Court, or whether he thinks that there is going to be, it will be suffice to have the process of the national reconciliation. Does he feel that there will be another step after that, which will go into the ICC? And finally, what measures are being taken to support Sri Lanka's pathway to become the pluralistic, multicultural democracy where all of its people can flourish? Recently, I had a wonderful briefing from a fantastic UK organisation called Halo Trust, which I know that the Minister and others in this place will know of their great work. And their work is coming to an end after a decade of sorting out landmines in the north of Sri Lanka. And I just hope that with the ending of that particular chapter and the opening of a new one where truth and reconciliation can be key, and where all of the diaspora and individuals who were so whose lives were destroyed by that dreadful civil war, is the Minister confident, or can he tell us what his concerns are, so that so that our Sri Lankan diaspora and those who care deeply about human rights in our constituencies can have the confidence that the UK government is doing its part to uphold peace and democracy. Thank you.
Minister. Well, thank you very much indeed, Sir Edward. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for securing this important debate. Of course, the Minister of State for the Indo-Pacific, the Right Honourable Member for Berwick-upon-Tweed, would normally be answering this debate, but she is, however, on a plane on her way to Australia, and it's therefore my pleasure to be here in her place. And I am grateful for all of the powerful and moving contributions from Honourable and Right Honourable members, and I'll try to cover off the points raised and set out the government's position. And of course, the UK government pays close attention to the human rights situation in Sri Lanka, especially for the many Tamils, the perils of which have been movingly and powerfully described today by all members. And I note particularly the interests of the all-party parliamentary group, and including the chair and other members, and I'm grateful for their contributions. Of course, Sri Lanka is one of 32 FCDO human rights priority countries. This is in recognition of our ongoing human rights concerns in a number of areas, including the rights of people from minority groups. As honourable members will know, and as described this afternoon, the continuing marginalisation and repression of Tamil communities follows many years of racial and religious tensions in the country, culminating in the Civil War, as described in very clear terms this afternoon. And it's important to recognise that a number of different communities, including Tamils, who predominantly reside in the north and east of the country, face this marginalisation, continue to face marginalisation by state authorities. There have been increasing land seizures and disputes which have sometimes centred around religious sites, such as the Ayanar Hindu temple in Mullaitivu. This clearly has troubling implications for freedom of religion or belief. And more recently, we're very clear that there has been state-sponsored settlement of traditional pasture land in Batikaloa, which threatens the livelihoods of local farmers, something that was referred to this afternoon. There have been several incidents of heavy-handed policing of peaceful protests and commemorations, and there is ongoing surveillance and intimidation by state security forces in the north and east of the country. This particularly focuses on civil society activists and Tamil communities affected by the war, including former combatants and the families of the disappeared. And of course, these events have increased heightened communal tensions, and they continue to stoke perceptions of forced displacement from traditionally Tamil areas. Now, a running theme was the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which was described in stark terms by a number of members. Of course, the UK government remains very concerned about the ongoing use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, despite the Sri Lankan government's long-standing commitment to replace this piece of legislation with an improved with a version that would meet its international obligations. It continues to be used as laid out this afternoon, as most recently as last week, and we continue to call on the government of Sri Lanka to deliver on its promises and live up to its international obligations. So the concerns laid out this afternoon with regard to the PTA legislation, we acknowledge. From the government side, promoting human rights, reconciliation and justice and accountability is a key strand of our policy towards Sri Lanka. The Minister of State for the Indo-Pacific visited Sri Lanka in October. When there, she met the President, the Foreign Minister and the Justice Minister. She also met the Governor of the Northern Province, as well as meeting Tamil representatives and civil society activists in Colombo and Jaffna. And she also visited community projects, including a demining project run by the Halo Trust and paid for by British assistance. Yes, delighted to give way.
Thank the Minister for giving way. Minister, it's just a side issue for what you said there. Minister, you mentioned about all that government's doing. Could I gently suggest, Mr. Chairman, that maybe perhaps when it comes to economic ties, whether it be banking, whether it be bigger business or whatever it may be, that the issue of human rights and the persecution of Christians, etc., are an integral part of any discussions that take place, and ensure that when you move forward, that those are conditional to the economic context. Just as a
well, he makes a good point, and those and the role of the trade envoy was mentioned this afternoon. Well, we're very clear that human rights and trade discussions go alongside. They are not mutually exclusive, and that's a perfectly reasonable suggestion. Whilst the Minister of State for the Indo-Pacific, returning to my commentary on her visit, she raised the needs for progress with the government of Sri Lanka on human rights for all communities in Sri Lanka, and she also raised the need for justice and accountability for violation and abuses committed during and following the armed conflict. And of course we recognise that also other communities in Sri Lanka, as mentioned this afternoon, including Muslims as well as Tamils, face discrimination, harassment and a lack of justice. Now, in addition to our face-to-face diplomacy, the UK government has an £11 million programme that supports human rights and reconciliation in Sri Lanka. We have specific projects and programmes that help tackle the legacy of the conflict, support civil society and democratic processes, promote gender equality and reduce inter-community tensions. And we've been a leading member of the core group of countries who work to improve human rights, justice and accountability in Sri Lanka, and we will continue to be in that core group. We have worked within the UN human rights system to raise concerns and build international support to strengthen human rights. And we used our statement to the UN Human Rights Council in September to highlight the vital need to respect freedom of religion or belief and freedoms of expression and association in Sri Lanka. And we also press for progress on justice, accountability and reconciliation. The UK delegation led work on the most recent UN Human Rights Council resolution on Sri Lanka, which the chair of the APPG asked about, and we will continue to use that as a tool to argue for progress. Yes, I'm delighted to give way.
I just wanted to get an assurance from him that the British government's relationship with Sri Lanka will ensure there is always unfettered access to UN human rights monitors and inspectors into Sri Lanka, because there have been at times more than reticence, indeed obstruction, towards their inspection, and it is obviously necessary to get an independent view of the situation.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman makes a good point. We continue to argue for unfettered access for those sorts of inspectors, and we will continue to do so. In that resolution, which was asked about by the chair of the APG, whom I could commend for his tremendously active carrying out of that office, in that resolution we focused international attention on the human rights shortcomings, and we succeeded in renewing the mandate of UN human rights experts to report on these issues and preserve evidence of abuses and violations committed during the armed conflict so that justice can be pursued. And we will continue to use that resolution as a lever to argue for positive change, and I'm grateful for the question from my honourable friend. Now, turning towards some of the small positive steps, because when working with countries to strengthen their human rights, their human rights adherence, it's important to acknowledge any progress that there may be. In that spirit, we welcome steps taken by the Sri Lankan government to address some Tamil grievances, including the release of some disputed lands and the release of long-term detainees. We welcome the government's engagement with Tamil representatives on a long sought-after political settlement, and we have urged the government to consider further confidence-building measures and engagement. We welcome steps taken by the government to improve connectivity between the north and counties between the north and countries in the region, including through regular flights. And we believe this should help increase economic opportunities for the North and others in that region. We also welcome the government's commitment to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we encourage them strongly to consult widely and come forward with detailed proposals. Sir Edward, delighted. Delighted.
I'm sure he genuinely believes the speech that he's making, but the Foreign Office have, in the last 13 years, been beseeching the Sri Lankan government for an independent truth and reconciliation process. To date, it hasn't happened. At what point will he try something else?
Well, these are clearly profoundly difficult issues which will not be solved quickly, but it is our judgment that we must continue with our diplomacy and our strong encouragement for the government of Sri Lanka to come forward with detailed proposals about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As unlikely as it may seem this afternoon, that is the intent of our diplomacy, and we will continue to do that. Now, Sir Edward, we will continue to. I will give way in a moment. We will continue to monitor human rights developments in Sri Lanka closely, including the marginalisation and repression faced by Tamil communities and other minorities. And I'm delighted to give way.
Would he undertake, given the scepticism about yet another announcement of this sort of process, would he therefore give pledge to continue more truthful and thorough approaches, for example, looking at the question which was raised earlier in the debate about the role of the ICC for certain of the terrible events that happened during the Civil War? Is it the assessment of the FCDO that there is a case to answer in the ICC?
Well, the Honourable Lady will know that the ICC, being independent, will make its own judgments about the prospect of prosecution. But of course, when it comes to the relationship that we have with the Sri Lankan government, candour is at the heart of that, and frank speaking is at the heart of that. And that's why we will continue to make the point about the need for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And of course, delighted.
To be too harsh on the honourable gentleman, particularly as he's standing in, but the honourable member for Glasgow North East used part of her speech from 2021. This sounds distinctly like the same response that we had at that debate, almost word for word. Could you just address one issue for me? Will the government, because this is solely up to the government, will the government now explore the use of the Magnitsky Clause sanctions against known human rights abusers from Sri Lanka?
Well, I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for his question. He, of course, will know that it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment on sanctions from the dispatch box, and no government minister would do that. But of course we note the strength of feeling expressed by honourable and right honourable colleagues this afternoon. And of course, sir, we are concerned about the ongoing land disputes, the continued harassment and surveillance of civil society, and limitations on freedom of expression, assembly and association. And we will continue to urge the Sri Lankan government to adhere to its human rights obligations and fulfil its commitments on transitional justice, legislative reform, and to take steps to build trust in its institutions. Very pleased to give way.
I understand the point he makes about not commenting on sanctions from the dispatch box. Could I just reiterate and re-urge him to take the strength of feeling from this debate, and for many years now we've been asking for this, to take that back to FCDO. On the point about the ICC, indeed it is independent. There are independent referrals to the ICC that private individuals are taking forward against certain members of Sri Lankan military society at the moment. Whilst the UK government is not engaged in that process, could I ask him to review whether or not the FCDO could, at the UN, encourage that information collection which is being done as part of the recent human rights resolution to be passed on to those who are trying to bring forward that prosecution?
Well, I know the Minister of State for the Indo-Pacific will in due course hear that plea and give it her consideration. I'll wrap up because I want to leave 2 minutes for the conclusion. But I'll conclude by saying, of course, the UK government will remain a leading role on the international stage, working with civil society and through the UN to deliver meaningful human rights improvements for Tamils and all Sri Lankans. And in response to the question posed by the Honourable Lady for Hornsey and Woods Green and the Right Honourable Member for Kingston and Surbiton, of course, when it comes to the role of the Foreign Secretary, let us be clear that as Prime Minister, Lord Cameron led the way in ensuring that the UK spearheaded international efforts to seek improved human rights, justice and accountability for sanctions. And that is something we should be very clear about. And of course, no one should doubt that our China policy is very clear-sighted. And any mature consideration of the facts will lead one to believe that the Foreign Secretary brings tremendous experience, credibility and integrity to his role. Thank you very much, Sir Edward.
Martyn Day, to sum up briefly.
We've had a very consensual debate from right across the House, which I think shows the strength of feeling that crosses